All right, all you positive heads. On this week's Soul Share episode, I'm very excited to have Ken Wilber here with me on the show. Ken is a revered philosopher, teacher, and author who is often referred to as the Einstein of consciousness studies, and also happens to be the most widely translated academic writer in America with 25 books translated into 30 foreign languages. Hey, Ken, welcome to the show, my friend.
Hey, good to see you.
Yeah, likewise. Been looking forward to this for some time, and I'm gonna kick things off with my cliche opening question, which is this: You're in an elevator. The woman next to you looks over, says, "What's your passion?" You have 10 floors to answer. What do you say?
What's my passion?
Yep.
I guess writing.
Hmm. That makes
Um,
sense.
I never planned on being a writer,
Mm-hmm.
um, but when I went to Duke University to be a doctor, and
Mm-hmm.
I decided not to be a doctor, so I switched to biochemistry and transferred to the University of Nebraska.
Mm.
And when I was 13 or so, I had had a spontaneous mystical experience.
Oh wow.
So I was walking through the woods and I was looking at a tree, and all of a sudden I became one with the tree.
Wow.
And from there, I became one with the forest and then one with the entire universe.
Wow.
And it was a very profound experience. And I never really forgot it. I mean, those kinds of things tend to stick in your mind.
Yeah.
Um, and it, I started asking questions about, well, what does this mean? And so I started studying the world's religions.
Mm-hmm.
But I had also, at that time, discovered developmental psychology.
Mm-hmm.
And I know this was fairly young to be doing this, but I was just always very curious and very academically interested. And
Sure.
so I started studying the developmental psychologists as well. And what really struck me about them was they all came up with certain stages of development that all human beings go through, starting with birth or maybe even in the womb. But um, Gene Gebser, for example, named these stages archaic stage, magic stage, mythic stage, rational stage, pluralistic stage, and integrated or systemic or integral stage. And what really blew me away is that as I studied all the developmental psychologists, and there are several dozen,
Mm-hmm.
they all came up with similar stages.
Mm-hmm.
And they would give them different names because what they were actually doing, and I don't know whether they knew they were doing this or not, but psychologists today believe that we have anywhere from 8 to 12 what they call multiple intelligences.
Mm-hmm.
So most people think they just have, they're just they have thinking, and that's when they're intelligent, and there's just this cognitive intelligence, and that's it.
Mm-hmm.
But developmentalists have learned that we have cognitive intelligence and between 8 and 12 other multiple intelligences. So we have cognitive intelligence, emotional intelligence, moral intelligence, aesthetic intelligence or capacity to see beauty, spatial intelligence, verbal intelligence, mathematical intelligence. And unfortunately, our education system really only educates two: cognitive intelligence and verbal intelligence.
Right.
And as for the other 10 or so, you were never trained to look for beauty, or you were
Mm-hmm.
never trained to look for
Right.
aesthetics or verbal. So when I first came on to multiple intelligences, the way I sort of learned them, because it's a real tenet of mine that everything I write about, I have experienced myself. I've gone through it myself. And
Mm-hmm.
if not, I do something in order to gain that understanding. because I
Mm.
think it's really important that I literally understand what I'm writing about.
Yeah.
It's particularly what I'm recommending to people.
Right.
So I took one of the multiple intelligences and I chose aesthetic intelligence, the perception of beauty.
Mm-hmm.
And for one day out of each week, I would simply look through the eye of beauty.
Mm.
And at first, I would see a few beautiful things, like maybe the mountain range covered in snow capped mountain tops. And that looked
Mm-hmm.
very beautiful to me.
Sure.
But then the more I kept looking for beauty, the more I would see it. And it was just everywhere.
Yeah.
And this profoundly blew me away because I had been staring at all this beauty all my life, but I never really realized it because I didn't know that I had an intelligence for that sort of experience.
Right.
Um, and then after I did beauty, I chose moral intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a very interesting intelligence to work with because almost all moral developmental psychologists believe that our moral intelligence goes through about 6 to 8 major stages of development, but they all break them down into 3 major groupings of our development. And
Mm-hmm.
it's called pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional.
Mm.
And a pre-conventional moral stance is just me. It's just I, me, mine. That's what's right, is what I want.
Yeah.
And that's the way a young child thinks. And so young children are very self-centered, and we know how that works out.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but then around age 5, 6 to 7, as they start to learn a cognitive development called concrete operational thinking, which Piaget defined as thought operating on the world.
Mm-hmm.
And the next higher stage is called formal operational thinking, which is thought operating on thought. So
Mm.
that gives us logic, mathematics, algebra, stuff like that.
Mm.
Um, but the conventional level of development tends to be what Jane Lovinger calls the conventional stages, the conformist stages. And she's studying the development of ego, our
Mm.
self development.
Mm-hmm.
And so she has them also go through a selfish stage, a care stage, or a conformist stage, and then a universal care stage.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but when you think in those moral terms and you're going from selfish concern to conformist concern, which is what's right is what my society wants,
Yeah.
what's right is what you think is right and he thinks is right and everybody thinks is right, and I need to conform with that
Yeah.
or I'll be really in trouble.
Right.
um, and then post-conventional, the highest stages, are beyond conformity. So they become very rational, very universal, what's true for everybody, not just one group and not just me, but what's right for all human beings.
Mm-hmm.
And to see how you can go through the all of those stages in a day is a real eye opener.
Yeah.
So, but my passion was to write all of this down. And I had, particularly as I was studying the world's mystical systems and the world's developmental psychology systems, I had actually stumbled on a couple of, they're sometimes occasionally mentioned by a developmental psychologist or two, but they're not that well advertised or well known. And one is that all of the multiple intelligences, and again, psychologists differ on how many exact multiple intelligence there are. There's between 8 and 12 of them.
Mm-hmm.
But all of them are again, because they're studying a different multiple intelligence, all of their stages have slightly different names. So
Mm-hmm.
we saw one group call the development of moral development, the conventional stage, and Jane Lovinger, studying ego development, calls it the conformist stage. But
Mm-hmm.
you can see how similar
Mm-hmm.
they are.
Mm-hmm.
But although there are upwards of a dozen multiple intelligences, and they each have different named levels of development, but they all go through the same basic stages or same basic levels of development. And you can figure this out by looking at how each developmentalist actually describes their stage. And you'll see, so when Kohlberg describes a conventional stage and Lovinger describes a conformist stage, they'll both describe it in similar terms.
Mm-hmm.
Focused on a group mentality, I must fit in, I must obey my society, and so on. But the real breakthrough for me was as I studied, after I had the spontaneous mystical experience and I started reading the world's mystical literature,
Mm-hmm.
I particularly was impressed by a Zen Buddhist writer named D.T. Suzuki. And he wrote a book called Essays in Zen Buddhism, which was actually a 3-volume set. And each book was quite lengthy. It was like, so
Mm-hmm.
the 3 of them were like about that.
Wow.
But I ripped through all of them and I was fascinated by this term that I had never heard before. And I'd never heard it before because it was a Japanese term. But it was mentioned throughout all of these books, and it was called Satori.
Mm.
And Satori, many Americans now know what a Satori is. They've heard of it. But Satori is exactly this direct, immediate, first-person experience of an identity with everything,
Yeah.
one with the all, one with the universe.
Yeah.
And that just blew me away. And Zen has what's called the 10 Zen ox herding pictures, and there are 10 pictures of the major stages in development that you go through to reach a full awakening or full enlightenment, which
Gotcha.
is the aim of Buddhist
Yeah. Right.
approach to reality.
Right.
Um, and I thought, when I saw those 10 Zen oxherding pictures, and I already had maps of almost all developmental psychologists' stages of growing up, and they were between 8 and 10 or occasionally 12 stages. But I looked at those 10 Zen oxherding pictures and I went, wow, they're the same as my developmental stages of development. These stages are everywhere because
Mm.
all mystical traditions had similar stages of development, and
Right.
all these developmental psychologists had similar stages of development. And I thought, wow, I have made a huge discovery.
Yeah.
But the more I looked at it, the more I realized that the stages, the 10 Zen oxherding pictures, have nothing really in common at all with the developmental stages of growing up. And so I called the awakening or enlightenment stages the process of waking up. And I called the developmental growth stages the processes of growing up.
Mm.
And me learning that there's a difference between waking up and growing up
Yeah.
was a real important discovery. And that wasn't really something that any developmental psychologist had realized.
Mm-hmm.
Most Westerners are unaware of a waking up possibility.
Right.
So the developmental psychologists weren't even looking for it. A few of them would realize that their highest stage was some sort of unity experience, but
Mm-hmm.
they had no idea that there was a whole series of religious mystical traditions the world over that had stages going up to that unity
Yeah.
stage. In other words, they were completely unaware of actually waking up.
Right.
But what that told me is that there were different types of wholeness.
Mm-hmm.
because waking up is obviously a waking up to an enormous wholeness, a wholeness, you're one with everything.
Yeah.
And growing up is also an increase in wholeness, because each stage, archaic to magic to mythic to rational to pluralistic to integral, transcended but included the previous stage. So
Right.
stages get more and more whole the more you grow up. And
Right.
at the upper stage, the integral stage, you're integrating all sorts of different personality structures and different thought structures. And if you're an intellect, you'll go in search of a systemic unifying system.
Yeah.
And that's what I started doing. Um, and I would go on to come up with three other types of wholeness. One called opening up, which was opening up to all of our multiple intelligences, because when I added beauty and morality and verbal and so on, I really got an expanded sense of reality,
Yeah.
because all of these things were available to me. And that was really an eye opener. Then there was what I call cleaning up, which is usually associated with the name. And this, by the way, expressing all of this is my passion, which is why I'm still wondering on about that question. Um, but cleaning up is generally associated with the name of Sigmund Freud and his inner circle. And Freud's inner circle were all bona fide geniuses. He just attracted, he was such a clear thinker, he attracted similar genius types.
Right.
So they included Carl Jung, which most people know his name,
Yeah. Yep.
Otto Rank, Alfred Adler, Salvador Ferenczi. All of them were real geniuses. And what they all discovered is that the mind, we can split off or dissociate or repress aspects of our psyche, of our mind, and we push them from a conscious state into an unconscious state.
Right.
And when Freud was asked, what does this new psychoanalysis of yours do? He famously replied, where id was, their ego shall be. And the id, of course, was the unconscious, and the ego was the conscious. And so it was to reunite your unconscious mind with your conscious mind.
Right.
And you can see this better when you realize that Freud himself never once used the term ego or id. They were put in his translations by his official translator, James Strachey, because they were Latin terms for what Freud used. And Strachey thought that the Latin terms made Freud sound more scientific. So what Freud used was, he didn't use id, he used the German pronouns for the it. And for ego, which was Latin for the self, Freud used the I, the ego. So what Freud really said was, where it was, there I shall become. And this includes it makes the mind whole and healthy. And you could really see this very clearly in one of Freud's followers, Fritz Perls. Fritz Perls was a very well-known, very famous superstar at Esalen Institute. Esalen Institute was founded by Mike Murphy, who, by the way, is a very good friend of mine. And Mike Murphy was left this land by his family in Big Sur, California, which is a beautiful, beautiful location next to the Pacific Ocean.
Yeah.
And on, you know it, yeah, cliffs and all that. And in Esalen, Perls he was very well known and very popular. So any time he gave a workshop, usually around at least 100 people would show up.
Yeah.
And Perls would always look in the audience and say, okay, who wants to work? Who has a neurotic problem and they want to work on? And somebody would come out of the audience, and Perls would put a chair down for them to sit in, and then he'd put another chair called the empty chair across from them. And he'd say, okay, what's your problem? And the person might say, well, I have this horrible anxiety and it really bothers me. And most people, when they repress something, they start referring to it as an it,
Mm.
because first person perspective is the perspective of the person speaking. So that's an I, me, mine.
Mhm.
Second person perspective is the person being spoken to. So that's a
Mhm.
you or thy or thine. And
Mhm.
third person is the person or thing being spoken about. So
Mm.
that's a he, she, they, them, it, or its. And when a person shoves some part of their I out of their I and make it a not self, they refer to it as just, it's an it. So they'll
Mhm.
say the anxiety, it drives me crazy, or the compulsion,
Yeah.
I can't control it, or the
Yeah.
obsession, it overwhelms me, so on.
Right.
So when Freud was asked, what does this new psychoanalysis of yours do? He didn't say where id was, their ego shall be. He said, where it is, their I shall become.
Mm.
In other words, he's reuniting the I with the it. And
Mhm.
you could see Pearls would actually do this when he'd sit somebody with the anxiety in the chair and he'd say, okay, I want you to put your anxiety in this empty chair and talk to it as a person.
Mm.
So ask it questions. And they say, well, like questions like what? And they say, well, ask it, why are you doing this to me?
Yeah.
Why is this anxiety annoying me? And then he'd have them sit back in their chair and listen to what the anxiety would say to him. And maybe the anxiety might say, why am I doing this to you? Because you're an idiot, because you're stupid, because you're no good. And then Pros would have them sit in their chair and talk back to the anxiety. And so the person say, well, I'm not that bad or whatever. And he would have them go back and forth and have this actual conversation.
Hmm.
And Pearls was a bit of a character.
Mhm.
And so he was known for saying things like, I can cure any neurosis in 15 minutes.
Yeah. Wow.
And the joke was, even his critics who had watched Pearls operating for a long time believed him. I mean, he really was a genius when it came to dealing with neurosis. And the reason is he worked with this where it was their I shall become. And
Mhm.
he'd have them do that by having a discussion between the I and the it.
Mhm.
And so after you've asked this it a question, then this it answers you, but you're answering, you're playing the it.
Right.
So your I is identifying with that it.
Yeah.
And after 10 or 15 minutes of fully identifying with that it would tend to reunite with your I. And everybody in the audience could see this person's anxiety start to disappear, and in some cases simply go away.
Yeah.
Um,
Wow.
so that became an important part of this integral approach that I was developing, which was my passion was to convey what this was about, because I felt I was coming upon some really unique and novel insights. And so I called waking up, growing up, opening up to all multiple intelligences, cleaning up all of our repressions and unconscious material. And then finally, I had what I called showing up. And showing up referred to the four quadrants, which often, when people talk about the four quadrants, they'll reduce them to what I call the big three. And the four quadrants are simply the inside and the outside, or the subjective and the objective view of an individual or a collective, a group. So the inside, and each of these go through various developmental stages. So the inside of an individual were the stages of growing up. So my interior inside goes from magic, from archaic to magic to mythic to rational to pluralistic to integral stages. And at each of those stages, I'll form a different worldview. At magic, I'll form a magical worldview. At mythic, I'll form a mythical worldview. At rational, I'll be a rational worldview. At pluralistic, it'll be a pluralistic postmodern view. And at integral, it's an integrated or systemic worldview. And that's called the upper left quadrant, because when I first wrote these down, I wrote them down on a big yellow legal pad as a cross like that.
Mhm.
And we just called them the upper left, the upper right, the lower left, and the lower right. And the upper left are both individual holons. A holon is a term invented by Arthur Kessler, and it means a whole that is part of another whole.
Right.
And everything in the universe is a holon.
Mm-hmm.
So atoms are made of a whole proton and a whole neutron and a whole electron come together as part of a whole atom. And then a whole atom joins other whole atoms to become parts of whole molecules. And whole molecules become parts of whole cells, and whole cells become parts of multicellular organisms, and so on. And that's the upper right, the exterior of an individual as it grows and develops through increasingly larger holons. And the upper left are the stages of interior growth and development, archaic to magic to mythic to rational to pluralistic to integral. Lower right is a collective of individual exterior things. So whole organisms come together into whole families come together into whole ecosystems come together into biospheres come together into a whole planet comes together into part of a whole solar system is part of a whole galaxy is part of the whole unit. You get it.
Right.
So that's the lower right. And the lower left quadrant is the growth of cultures or societies. And they go from small tribal societies to small villages that are parts of larger towns, or part of cities, parts of states, parts of nations, parts of the planet Earth, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
So those four quadrants happen to be also the names. We have names for them. We call them first person perspective, second person perspective, third person perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And many developmental psychologists continue it into a fourth person, fifth person, sixth person, and even seventh person perspective. But these are just the capacity of one perspective to be aware of another perspective.
Mm-hmm.
So my first person, I, me, mine, can become aware of you. Mm-hmm. And that's a second person perspective. It's defined as the person being spoken to. And then that I can also become aware of a third person, he, she, they, them, it, or its. And Jane Lovinger, in her developmental scale of the interior of an individual, her growth stages that go through, they're not directly called archaic, magic, mythic, rational, mm-hmm. pluralistic, or integral, but they're described in similar terms. As we said, all these different multiple intelligences are different lines going through the same levels of development.
Right.
And she defines each one of her stages as adding a further perspective. So the first stage has capable of first person perspective, second stage is capable of a second person perspective, third stage is capable of a third person perspective, and so on. And so the upper left is the interior of an individual. So that's a first person perspective, an I, me, mine. The lower left is a collective of you and me. And it's a culture, it's a society. And so we're aware of a you in the society. We're aware of second person perspective. And then the third person is the objective realities. of a he, she, they, them, it, or its, and that's a third person perspective. Um, and the lower right quadrant is a fourth person perspective. And then Jane Lovinger has a fifth person perspective on her fifth stage, a sixth person perspective on her sixth stage, and a seventh person perspective on her seventh stage. And she has seven or so major stages of development that she has determined by actually studying people as they grow up. And that's what all developmental psychologists do. They study people and they watch what stage of development they're at, what their
Mm-hmm.
cognitive stage of development is at, and what worldview it has, and what moral stance it has, and stuff like that. And as they continue watching a person grow and develop, they'll notice their worldviews are changing, their
Mm-hmm.
cognitions are changing, they're becoming larger, they're becoming more whole, they're becoming more inclusive, they're larger holons. And this is so non-obvious. You can't, unlike an experience of waking up, all waking up experiences are first person, direct, immediate, personal, aware experiences. If you're sitting in the woods and you become one with the woods and one with the earth and one with the universe in love and bliss, you know it. You know you're one with everything. You know you're in love. You know you're being drenched in bliss.
Hmm.
It's completely obvious. But while you're having that waking up experience, you have no idea that you're at a stage of growing up. You
Mm-hmm.
can't look within and see it. These stages of growing up are very much like grammar. We
Mm-hmm.
all are following large sets of rules of grammar or syntax, but we have no idea what these rules of grammar are. We can't look within and see our rules of grammar. The last time we really knew a rule of grammar was when we were being taught grammar in third or fourth grade, and we learned certain rules. Subjects have verbs, and some verbs have objects, and all of that. Um, but none of these stages can be seen by looking within. So, unlike waking up, all of whose stages can be directly and immediately felt as a first person experience,
Yeah.
those were discovered, they go back at least 20,000 years to some of
Yeah.
the earliest shamans who would
Right.
have these great mystical experiences of oneness with the earth and so on. But growing up stages weren't discovered until around 100 years ago
Mm.
by America's probably second greatest psychologist named James Mark Baldwin, who was friends of America's greatest psychologist, William James.
Mm-hmm.
And interestingly, while William James was studying the varieties of religious experience, he actually wrote a book called The Varieties of Religious Experience. And those are all direct, first person, mystical states of consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
His friend James Mark Baldwin was studying the levels or the structures or the stages of consciousness and growing up.
Right.
And both of them were operating around the turn of the 1900s.
Mm.
So um, it's a very recent discovery, in other words.
Right.
Um, and showing up, to finish with that thought, is first person, second person, third person, fourth person quadrants. Um, and I put all those together to come up with the so-called integral framework, which is quadrants, levels, lines, states, and types.
Mm-hmm.
Also known as waking up, growing up, opening up, cleaning up, and showing up. And most people have never heard of any of those, except for types. Types is like male and female and so on. Um, but um, I first came up with the notion of different structures and states of consciousness in the first book I wrote, which I wrote when I was 23 years old, and it's called The Spectrum of Consciousness. And the idea was that our consciousness exists in a whole series of bands or levels or
Mm.
colors or stages or even states. Um, and that was a big breakthrough for me. But
Yeah,
an even
23,
bigger,
that's a pretty ambitious topic to tackle.
yeah, yeah. Um, but I knew I had had a mystical experience, so I knew there was a different type of consciousness
Right.
available. So that led me to the notion of a spectrum. Um,
Have you
but
had multiple of those? I'm just curious if you've
as
had multiple, you said the first was at 13. And have you had that repeat throughout your life at various times?
Yes,
Yeah.
but the reason is that when I first started studying mystical experiences and I found the works of D.T. Suzuki and Zen Buddhism, I just fell in love with Zen Buddhism.
Yeah.
It was its whole purpose of existence is to produce a mystical state of unity consciousness.
Yeah.
That's all Zen is about. That's all it wants. And
Yeah.
it calls it Satori, and it doesn't even deal with like subtle energies like Tibetan Buddhism is just doused with all sorts of subtle energies and causal states. And all. Zen's just, no, I want Satori. Show me your original face, the
Mm,
face you had before your parents were born. That's a very famous Zen koan.
mm,
And it means, show me the face you have in eternity.
yeah.
And eternity is just the timeless now, because all we're ever really aware of is a timeless now. So you think, well, there's a past. Well, think of anything you want to from the past and get a very good image of it. And notice that all you're aware of is a present memory state.
Hmm.
The entire past, your entire past, exists only in your mind in this timeless now. And
Mm,
you can do the same thing. Think about the future, and it's that future thought is a present thought. It's
right.
happening in the timeless now.
Right.
But so Zen has you focus on the timeless now. And the more you do that, the more you overcome time and space and become one with everything.
Yeah.
So as soon as I found out about Zen Buddhism, I went in search of a Zen master, of
Mm,
course. And I was a child of the 60s. And in the 60s, there was an enormous, well, it was a psychedelic generation. So a lot of people knew that you could have very far out
mm,
mystical states of consciousness.
right.
And many of them started studying Zen Buddhism.
Mm,
Because although all the world's mystical traditions aim for a satori or unity state of consciousness, Zen just focuses on that
solely.
exclusively.
Yeah.
So I went out and found, well, several Zen masters, but I started studying with a real Zen master. And after 2 or 3 years of Zen practice and study, I had a Zen Satori, which
Mm,
is another unity experience. And I practiced Zen for the first 15 to 20 years of my adult life. And I had 3 or 4 Satori experiences during that time.
wow.
And then I switched to Tibetan Buddhism simply because I felt that I had gotten what I was supposed to get
Yeah.
out of Zen Buddhism. And now I wanted to study all these other aspects of Buddhist life and spiritual life in general.
Wow.
Um, and that's when I was very deep into this integral framework I was developing.
Mm,
Um, so um, my passion is that writing, and it's just I have a fairly standard writing chronology, which is that um, I tend to write all my books in my head before I write them down.
mm,
And so it doesn't take me very long to write a book because I'm just transcribing what I've already written
yeah.
in my head.
Right.
And so it takes me maybe a month to write a full book.
Wow.
Um, and so and when I am writing, I'm just passionately writing. So I'll wake up at like 4 or 5 in the morning, and I immediately get out of bed. I don't make breakfast. I don't brush my teeth. I don't nothing. I just go straight to my desk, sit down, and start writing. And I'll start writing exactly where I left off the day before.
Yeah.
And I just keep writing
Mm-hmm.
nonstop. Literally, I've never had writer's block, although
Mm-hmm.
I begged for it a couple times. But I just uh, excruciatingly just write out everything, and I'll write for 4, 5, 6 hours,
Wow.
and then I'll stop and maybe watch a movie or read a book or something, and then go to bed, and then get up the next day
Do it
at
again.
4 or 5 and start writing again.
Mm.
And that's just been my passion. And so I've written basically a book a year for, well, I've published 35 books. So
Wow.
I've done that essentially for 35 years.
Wow. Wow. That's incredible. I'm curious because you've looked so closely and studied, consciousness. And here we are on the precipice of like, you know, AI becoming
Right,
this dominant intelligence on the planet, and I'm curious what someone who's been on the journey that you've been on for all
right.
these years thinks about this AI phenomenon.
Yeah, well, it's very interesting. AI so far is basically an algorithmic event.
Yep.
And an algorithm is a mathematical equation that defines how the process is going to unfold and so on.
Yep.
And they still haven't cracked what's called general intelligence.
Right.
It's a specific, so you can get AI intelligent um, programs for an enormous number of things, including writing poetry or
Mhm.
drawing art
Yep.
pictures and so on. But they don't have a general intelligence. They don't have one program that will do all of those
Yeah.
things.
Yeah.
And when general intelligence is discovered, they call that a singularity, because that's
Mhm.
going to mean that in order to get that degree of AI, it's going to have to at least be as smart or smarter than the average human being.
Right.
And that's what they're looking for. So I have, it's people that are looking for the singularity are looking for when AI can cover most things that human beings can do,
Mhm.
that that's when a truly integral approach will be necessary. So I have several fairly large and well-known AI companies that are working with the integral approach to develop AI systems that incorporate the integral framework. So they're
Mm.
working with waking up, growing up,
Mm.
cleaning up, um, opening up, and showing up.
Mhm.
And I'm glad to meet with them, and we have meetings probably once a month, when they'll send some of their best people by here, and we'll just hang out for a couple
Mm.
of days and
Mm.
talk about
Mhm.
stuff. Um, and I'm fairly optimistic about how AI will go, especially if it incorporates an integral framework.
Mhm.
Because most of the scary scenarios about what AI does is it misinterprets some human command that's been written into its program.
Yeah.
So AI might start to see human beings as a threat to their
Which
existence.
is not an integral perspective, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And so if it does have a more integral perspective, it's very hard to think of something that AI would do to humans that would erase humans if
Right.
it's thinking integrally.
Right. 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 Because yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Ultimately, it understands the importance of humans in its own existence,
Right,
and that it's an extension of them, of that intelligence in some
right,
way.
right,
And if you're going to destroy that, the human, you are destroying a part of self in a
right.
sense. Therefore, you know
That's
uh,
right.
uh, demolishing wholeness.
Right.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah. Very, very interesting. Well, that's. I'm glad to hear that you were involved in working and sort of consulting with some of these AI companies,
Right.
because yeah, that you know,
Well, thank you for that.
yeah, yeah. So, with your new book, um, obviously you've written a ton. Your brand new book is about to come out, Finding Radical Wholeness.
Right.
And, obviously people are going to need to go read it to really get the full download. And you've shared some of that here today. But,
Right.
what are some highlights that, I like the subtitle, The Integral Path to Unity, Growth, and Delight.
Right.
And so, uh, can you just speak to that even, just share a little bit?
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Um, well, basically, we've gone over several of the ingredients of the integral framework,
Yep.
and each of these ingredients aim for a different type of wholeness.
Mm-hmm.
And the way you get a complete wholeness is you use all of them.
Yep.
So we have waking up, which gives us a wholeness with the entire universe, a oneness with the all, a oneness with everything. This is very common in typical mystical experiences
Yeah.
in religions the world over.
Yep.
And almost all world religions have a mystical core.
Yeah.
Um, and the person that first invented or introduced that religion is a person that had a genuine satori, a real waking up, and then they examine themselves for why that happened, and then they try to teach others how to have that same experience.
Right.
So in Christian mysticism, it's St. Paul says that we all may be one as we are with Christ.
Yeah.
And so the typical Christian mystic will say, not I, but Christ liveth in me.
Yeah.
And that's a Christ consciousness, which is one with everything.
Yeah.
So it's a very big wholeness. But what most researchers the world over have not realized is that it's not a complete wholeness. There are at least 4 other types of wholeness that are not included in the waking up event. And one of them is growing up.
Mm-hmm.
And again, as I mentioned, growing up was only discovered. We only knew there were these stages of growing up about 100 years ago
Yeah.
because of James Mark Baldwin.
Yeah.
And he first looked at the lines of the good, the true, and the beautiful. And those are what I call the big 3, which remembers the way the 4 quadrants often show up as is the 3 quadrants, because the upper left quadrant is the I space, and the lower left quadrant is the we space, and the right hand quadrants are he, she, they, them, but it's also just all objects. It's it and its space. So um, that um, that's been known for a fairly long time. First person, second person, third person pronouns, um, and the growing up stages grow through those perspectives, as in
Mm-hmm.
Jane Lovinger's. Um, and once we got a sense of growing up, and once we discovered that there was the good, the true, and the beautiful, the good is moral intelligence. What's the best, the good, the right thing to do, and how I treat you. That's a moral or an ethical or a goodness um, perspective.
Yep.
And the true is objective truth, as in science, and those are all the right hand quadrants. Individual objective is the upper right, and collective objective, ecosystems, planets, stuff like that, is the lower right. Um, and the beautiful, the beauty which is in the eye, the upper left eye of experience. And so those were the first 3 lines of intelligence that James Mark Baldwin investigated, and he found that each of those lines went through 6 or 7 major stages of development. And he'd give them terms like pre-logical, hyperlogical, extralogical, and so on, translogical. But they were each defined in a different way, and they each had a different perspective. Um, and that's a wholeness that most people don't know about, because nobody can look within and see these stages of development. The only way you learn that you have these stages and what their experiences are like is by reading a book of developmental psychology, and then you're going to see all of these stages laid out in one or more multiple intelligences. But it's very useful to recognize what stage you're at.
Right.
And for several reasons. One is, if you're at, let's say, a conventional level of moral development and yourself is conformist, and you want to fit in with everything, it's good to know that that's what's driving you.
Yeah.
Because the second reason it's a good idea to know what stage you're at is research has shown that if people simply learn the names of the various stages of a developmental sequence, they actually develop through that sequence faster, in a quicker way. And so if you just simply learn the names of the stages of Jane Lovinger's development, or Lawrence Kohlberg's development, or Jean Piaget's development, you'll develop through those stages faster. And that's good to know. And that's also something that you'll want to do.
Do you think that holds true for society as a whole, in our collective development?
In a certain sense, it does. Simply because if it's holding for society as a whole, it's going to hold for most members will know what society knows. And so most members will be growing faster through these stages. And the more most members of the society grow through a stage, the more the society itself will express that.
Right.
So that's another. And waking up, you can have as many waking up experiences as you want and still be at the rational stage of development, or at the pluralistic stage of development, or even at the integral stage of development. But you'll never know you're at those stages when you have that waking up, because the waking up won't tell you anything about stages of growing up. So you'll know your stages of waking up if you're practicing them, but you won't, unless you learn integral map or developmental map, you'll have no idea what stage of growing up you're at. And that can be a real problem. And most of my eventual complaints about Zen Buddhism is that Zen masters had no idea of what stage of growing up they were at. And moreover, they didn't have a clue as to what stage of growing up their students were at. So they would generally treat their students from the same stage that they themselves were at.
Like treating a third grader the same as a 10th grader.
Right. That's right. And it leads to all sorts of problems.
Yeah.
Not least of which is the one you mentioned. And all Zen masters were making this mistake because they didn't know about the stages of growing up. They, of course, were brilliant in reproducing stages of waking up in their students, but they didn't have a clue where they were on the growing up scale. And that growing up scale covers a huge domain, from the archaic stage, which is driven by just your simple physiological needs, what Maslow's needs hierarchy would call the physiological needs: food, hunger, shelter, sex, and so on. And that's entirely different from a mythic stage, which populates the world with all sorts of mythic supernatural beings. And although you can no longer perform magic yourself, you can perform magic at the magic stage, which is the second major stage of development, because your mind is not yet fully differentiated from the world you're looking at.
Mm-hmm.
So, because when you're born, you just don't have much of a mind. And as the mind develops, it has a hard time distinguishing the word from the thing the word represents.
Mm-hmm.
It's called the signifier and the referent. Those tend to be still fused. And so, if you use a word like tree and you alter the word, you'll think the real tree has been altered magically. And
Mm-hmm.
that's where the name magic comes from.
Mm.
When you move to the next stage, the mythic stage, you postulate a whole realm of supernatural beings: Zeus, Apollo, Aphrodite,
Mm-hmm.
Venus, etc. And they all live on Mount Olympus, which is a real place.
Mm-hmm.
And many developmentalists call the mythic stage the mythic literal stage, because all the myths are taken as literally true.
Mm-hmm.
And what a mythic being can do, which you can no longer do, you can no longer yourself perform magic, because your brain, your mind has differentiated from the world. And so when you say tree, you recognize that there's a word tree,
Yeah.
and the tree is representing a real tree. You can tell them apart.
Yeah. Right.
But you can no longer, so you can no longer perform magic.
Hmm.
But the supernatural beings can.
Mm-hmm.
And if you know how to pray correctly to a god, or worship him correctly, or maybe
Mm-hmm.
perform a real sacrifice, including originally human sacrifices, then you would please that god, and that god would perform magic on behalf of you. It would
Right.
make the crops grow, it would get you the new car, it gets you the girl, whatever.
Right.
Um, so they're magically abundant. Um, so that was growing up, which was a different type of wholeness from waking up. And they were completely independent of each other. And then opening up was discovering all your multiple intelligences and awakening or opening up to all of them, or as many of them as you can. And the more you open up to, the larger your worldview becomes,
Mm.
because you're seeing morality, you're seeing beauty, you're seeing math, you're seeing verbal, you're seeing all sorts of things that you didn't know was there, because you didn't know that you had an intelligence for it. And waking up won't give you that. Um, Growing up, in the sense that all multiple intelligences do grow up, so all of those lines of intelligence go through the same levels of intelligence. So in a sense, all multiple intelligences are growing up. Uh, and so in that sense, they're intertwined.
Mm.
Um, but they can develop at very different rates. And your multiple intelligences, you can go through some very quickly, some very slowly, and some not at all. But that's opening up, and that obviously produces another type of wholeness. When you're opening up to all of your
Mm-hmm.
multiple intelligences, you have a really significantly huge whole.
Yeah.
Um, and then cleaning up, of course, we've talked about. And when it has reintegrated with your I, you produce a whole and healthy psyche or mind. And that's a very important type of wholeness. Most people don't realize that they are repressing and then projecting the repressed part of themselves, usually onto other people.
Mm-hmm.
So you might have a boss, and if you are very self-controlling, but you don't admit it, or you aren't aware of it, you'll project that self-controlling onto your boss. And then you'll react very negatively to your boss, because he's always trying to control you. He's so self-controlling. And that's you seeing you
Mm-hmm.
projected.
Mm-hmm.
And so you want to get that back, take back. And most people don't realize, if you look around in your environment, the things that annoy you that don't just inform you, that irritate you, that annoy you. Almost all of those, psychologists have demonstrated, are projections of your own shadow material,
Yeah.
your own unconscious material.
Right.
And when people get that realization and they start taking back their projections, they grow enormously.
Right.
It's amazing
You can actually
because you
deal with
just,
it head on, as opposed to like in some weird, you know, sort of, well, projected way that is making it not taking the accountability that's necessary in order to work through and integrate, right?
that's right. Um, and that in itself. Well,
Or
many
transmute.
people go to therapists for years
Yeah.
because it really takes them several years to reintegrate all that material that we projected.
Yeah.
And since we're sort of taught to project by this culture, I mean, what do you, from early age, if something goes wrong, what do? You find somebody to blame it on.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, they're doing it. They're controlling me, or they're lusting after me, or whatever it is. But we just project an enormous number of our traits, our motivations, our needs, our wants, our desires. Almost all of some of those are projected.
Mm-hmm.
And so taking it back can take a year or two or three or even more.
Yeah.
And so it's a real process and it gives a genuine wholeness.
Yeah.
So that's cleaning up. And then showing up, of course, is just using all four quadrants. Um, and the reason that's important is after I developed the four quadrants, first person, second person, third person, fourth person, I realized that a hold on in any quadrant could itself be looked at from the inside or the outside,
Mm-hmm.
from a left hand perspective or a right hand perspective, from a subjective perspective or an objective perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And anytime I did that, um, I noticed that I had generated a type of methodology, maybe empiricism, which is the study of the inside of a sensory awareness, or hermeneutics. Hermeneutics is the art and science of interpretation. So you and I are engaged in hermeneutics right now as we interpret each other. But each inside or outside of a hold on in every quadrant, which gave me 8 different new hold ons or new insides, or each of those had a different methodology that was already well known, that already existed and was well known. So that gave me 8 methodologies
Mm-hmm.
that this integral framework had generated and had shown where the origin of this methodology came from.
Mm-hmm.
It was like a lower right quadrant, hold on, looked at from within, or
Mm-hmm.
it's an upper left quadrant, hold on, looked at from without. And I'll give you an example in the upper left. If we're looking at an interior hold on, it could be like a thought or an emotion or a drive. And we look at the interior of that drive. So we're looking at the first person of a first person of a first person hold on. That's simply our immediate direct experience. That's what I am feeling in the true, real I-ness of my interior.
Mm-hmm.
If I look at that interior hold on from the outside, I'll get a stage of development. I'll get it studied in an objective, scientific fashion.
Mm-hmm.
And that's different from if I'm just directly and immediately aware of it. So
Mm-hmm.
that's why you can have an inside and an outside
Mm-hmm.
of a hold on, which
Mm-hmm.
is already the inside of an outside.
Mm-hmm.
And that gave me 8 methodologies. And I pursued all 8 of those methodologies very clearly. And they were all very real. And there was an enormous entire disciplines dedicated to each methodology. And so that was a huge understanding.
Mm.
And when you show up for all four quadrants, you're showing up for all eight methodologies,
Right.
or at least you have the capacity to understand those methodologies and to actually use them.
Wow.
And so, what I did in finding radical wholeness is start out by pointing out that most people like to think of themselves as maybe being holistic or a whole. I said, but there's not just one type of wholeness.
Mm-hmm.
So if you consider yourself holistic, I'm going to show you 5 different ways that you can be whole. And I'll
Mm-hmm.
bet you right now you're not aware of all 5.
Wow.
Um,
That's powerful. I mean, I think, that's it's as we know, oftentimes we'll have a strength in one area and not in another, and so it really seems like with this book, it's going to shine a light on all the all the quadrants, if you will, and
right,
I think that is a necessary thing to do if we want to become our greatest and greatest selves.
right. So that's what I do. So each chapter in Finding Radical Wholeness gives a different type of quadrant, and then it explains the methodologies in each
Cool.
quadrant, and then
Amazing.
it goes through levels of development. And it turns out that these levels go through all 4 quadrants. They show up in very different ways, but you can recognize the same degree of growth and development in all of them. And then I go through lines, or all the multiple intelligences that are the things that are actually growing up.
Mm-hmm.
So cognitive development, moral development, aesthetic development, um, of beauty, spiritual development, and so on.
Wow.
And spiritual development in growing up is different from a spiritual awakening in waking up,
Mm-hmm.
because what you're doing is you're simply taking a sort of a religious or spiritual approach to whatever level of development you're at. And a researcher named James Fowler actually, as any developmentalist does, he developed a test of what he felt were, from some preliminary research, he found that there were 6 different levels of growing up
Mm-hmm.
in your spiritual view of the world.
Mm. Interesting.
And so you could be a real religious believer, in which case you were at, in essence, the mythic stage, the mythic
Mm-hmm.
literal stage of development. So you believe there's a real God. And if you're Christian, you believe the real God had the one and only Son of the one and only God, and he was born from a virgin, and he died and rose for your
Mm-hmm.
sins. You mythically, literally believe all of that, and you're at stage 4.
Yeah.
So he then gave this test over 1,000 people, and he found that those he had, in fact, hit on 6 major stages of spiritual development.
Mm.
But you can be at any one of those stages of spiritual development and not actually have a spiritual experience of
Yeah.
waking up.
Yeah.
Waking up and growing up are 2 different things.
Right.
And just technically, waking up consists of states of consciousness, and growing up consists of structures of
Mm.
consciousness.
Wow.
And a structure of consciousness is, for example, as we said, it's like the rules of grammar.
Yeah.
There, and we, every multiple intelligence has a structure, goes through structures
Yeah.
that themselves grow through stages. So we often call them structure stages. And each stage has its own structure,
Yeah.
its own grammar. Whereas waking up goes through first person
Yeah.
experiential
Wow.
stages. So we sometimes call those state stages. So state stages in waking up structure stages and growing up. And those aren't the same. And that, by the way, was a major discovery. The difference between state stages and structure stages, the difference between waking up and growing up.
Yeah.
As I mentioned, almost no developmental psychologist in the West has any understanding of waking up, let alone a real enlightenment or a real satori or a real
Right.
awakening experience.
Yeah.
So then, opening up is different from
Yeah.
waking up and growing up, and I went through that.
And this is all broken down in the book,
Right.
essentially, right? So
Right.
I think, yeah, that's wonderful that, you know, people will have, because it's a lot to digest. So I think it's wonderful that you have this book, that new book that, you know, really can allow people to sit with it and spend the time
And
with
then
it.
each of those lines of development, each of the multiple intelligences that go through these various levels of growing up, I then give a chapter or two on actual practices
Great.
or exercises you can do
Mm-hmm.
to grow through those stages.
Mm.
And I do that with waking up and growing up and opening up and cleaning up and showing up. So
Excellent.
it's not just an introduction to all those elements, it's an actual practice manual for each of them.
Amazing, amazing. Well, this has been such an incredible conversation, Ken. I feel like you could go on for a lot longer because there's so much deep wisdom to share, and that's why I'm so grateful that the book is here. Maybe you can come back on sometimes. But with the new book, I'm assuming available everywhere. You know, you
Yes.
can get your books and.
Yeah, I just got it, my own copy, a few days ago, but that means all the bookstores got their copies a few days ago.
Excellent.
So you can get it anywhere. You can order it on Amazon.
Amazing. Amazing. Well, any as you know, we kind of wind down here, anything that you would like to, you know, share with the audience? Obviously, what's the best way for them to connect with you and continue to follow your work outside of, you know, of course, getting your books?
You can email me at ken@kenwilber.com.
Cool.
And that's Wilber.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Well, Ken, thank you so much for taking the time to come on and share your wisdom and insights and all the work that you do. It's really powerful. I'm excited to
Thank you.
check out this book and share with others as well. And yeah, thank all of you out there for tuning in your beautiful brainwaves and incredible hearts to another episode. Until next time, journey well.
I love you so much.